Following the 2022 midterms, the conservative movement and the Republican Party broadly seems more fractured and factionalized than ever, with nearly every corporate media outlet reporting a supposed inevitable red wave in the midterms. Much of the Republican voter base kind of walked away from the midterms feeling pretty disappointed, as the Republican Party failed to take the Senate and even lost a lot of the competitive House races. And the reason that these midterms in particular were so important for the Republicans is because this election cycle was supposed to be something of a prequel to the presidential primaries and the red wave to come in 2024. And given this, the various factions of the conservative movement have been trying everything in their power to shift the blame off of their faction and place it on the lap of another competitive faction, supposedly. And of course, all this blame shifting is with the intention to keep their faction in the good graces of the conservative movement in order that they can improve their chances that their representative of their faction can be propelled to get the presidential nomination come 2024. And the Republican Party has been collapsing in on itself, leading to a quasi-conservative cold civil war of sorts, where political figures of largely the same outlook, of largely the same positions, are publicly attacking one another. And this Republican division is spiraling out of control and quickly becoming the mainstream culture, frankly. And I think we need a counterculture. I'm Carson Wolf. You're watching Counterculture. Let's get into it. Good evening, Wolfpack. Welcome to Counterculture. We have an excellent episode planned out for you guys tonight. I know you're going to love it. We are helping you navigate the Republican factions that are appearing right now, and we're discussing all of the factions of the Republican Party going into the 2024 primaries. And this division has really started to get dangerously apparent right after the midterms, with former President Donald Trump already announcing his bid for the nomination in 2024. And he did this 2 years in advance to the primaries. And there's been a Republican civil war that has been taking place ever since as this factionalization grows further and further. And further proving that this is the weirdest timeline, yay 2024 has become a thing. But as Republicans move away from the midterms and into thinking about 2024, the voter base and the broader political apparatus seems more factionalized than before. If we thought that was even possible, you know. Factions that Mr. Z and I covered in our previous series have split into various sub-factions in order to put up the candidate that they want most. And meanwhile, factions that were previously considered emerging factions are now upholding high publicity figures to put up to their nomination. These growing divisions that fracture the Republican Party and could spell disaster for the Republican Party if the faction which comes out on top is not able to reunify the party at all. But nonetheless, these are the factions and the candidates that they're holding up. And the first faction that we are going to be talking about is what I call the Main Street Republicans. So you might know the Main Street Republicans by a different name. The Main Street Republicans can more commonly be known as the neoliberals, which are a sub-faction of the neoconservative faction talked about in our previous series. The neoliberals largely are focused on foreign policy and diplomacy, while surrendering domestic and cultural positions to the left. And this foreign policy focus could prove beneficial to their pack, given the ongoing Russia-Ukrainian war. I think that the figure most likely to be chosen to represent the neoliberals in 2024 will be Nikki Haley. Haley has been propped up as something of a darling of the liberal conservative movement. President Trump appointed her as the United States' ambassador to the UN from 2017 to 2018, and in effect, she became a major figure in the Republican Party. After she stepped down as the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley has been angling to run for president. Since then, she's positioned herself as an enemy of the MAGA movement, and it appears she found her place in the neoliberal faction. But what would a Nikki Haley presidency look like? Well, Haley herself is a broadly conservative figure. However, she abandons a lot of her domestic conservatism in favor of expanding economic liberalism across the globe. Thus, her policies of immigration reform, pro-life positions, school choice and such would likely be thrown out the window in order to amp up U.S. intervention in Israel and Syria. Given that the majority of the president's responsibility is centered around his role as commander-in-chief, Israeli militarization would likely be the focus of her administration. All in all, we could expect to see a largely strong interventionist foreign policy of antagonism nationalism against China, Palestine, and Russia. Domestically, however, Haley would pursue a more liberal agenda. Due to the Republican voter base becoming increasingly skeptical of interventionist foreign policy and overseas wars, the neoliberals would likely collaborate with Democrats in order to achieve their foreign policy goals, thus sacrificing many of the key culture war issues on the top of Republican voters' agendas. It would likely support further attempts to expand LGBT ideology and protect its position in public life, given Haley's public criticisms of President Trump's exclusion of transgenderism in the military. Additionally, she would likely increase border security, but then increase immigration in order to increase commercial activity and stimulate the economy, further inflaming cultural divisions within the U.S. Haley is supported by a larger political establishment within the security apparatus. Expect to see figures and sitting politicians who are all faction members like Dan Crenshaw, Paul Ryan, and possibly figures like Mitt Romney coming out in support of her. Additionally, expect overwhelming support from the Israel lobby. As for her odds, I give Haley about a 5% chance at success in this field. Pretty much every candidate analysis of the field has shown Haley's appeal dwindling among Republican and independents. At the Western Conservative Summit in Denver, Haley polled at only about 19%, placing last among fellow Republicans when asked if voters would approve of if she was named the nominee come 2024. Their main support base is among fiscal conservatives and market advocates, transnational corporations, old female Republicans aged 65 and up, and disaffected non-religious Trump supporters. Her support is largely fragmented throughout the South, with her biggest pockets of support coming from North and South Carolina, but even in those two states, the GOP is more likely to support other factions. At the end of the day, she will position herself as an enemy of the Trump revolution and seek to appeal to disaffected Trump voters from 2020 by painting herself as a return to normalcy for conservative politics. And this likely won't play too well. When all is said and done, neoliberal victory in the approaching great game would grant too much influence to this waning and highly overrepresented subfaction of the conservative movement. And this faction and its liberal leanings would greatly disenfranchise the conservative base that was energized by the Trump MAGA movement. The neoliberals would almost certainly fail to unify the party under a cohesive vision for a conservative America, as it really is a rather liberal vision that Democrats would support. Neoliberal dominance would fracture the Republican Party and splinter the party to adopt independent political pacts between various factions of the Republican Party. This would largely relegate the Republican Party to a merely regional pact or a state-level party. And if there comes out a scandal about Haley in the build-up to the primaries, or she just doesn't reach as well as the Main Street Republicans want her to, I could see them putting up an alternative candidate for the nomination. Given that Haley is not a long-term face for the faction, I can see them putting up Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska, to fill up an alternative role. Sasse has really made himself an enemy of the Trump movement and has made a name for himself as it, so expect to see either Haley or Sasse on the primary stage come 2024. But that does it for the neoliberal faction, and the next faction that we're going to be talking about and breaking down is what is known as the Neoconservative Faction. Okay, so we all know who the neoconservatives are. We covered them in our past series. But this is a more dominant side of the broader neoconservative faction because they largely got in line with Donald Trump's MAGA movement and utilized a lot of the energy it provided. However, we shouldn't be fooled because the neoconservative faction is just another side of a pact between neocons and neolibs. This was showcased following the 2022 midterms, as many of these figures blamed the failure of conservatives on populists like Trump. This faction largely stands for the same things as neoliberals, but takes another approach by putting more of an emphasis on the failures of liberals' foreign policy instead of making villains of fellow Republicans. The root mentality of this faction is based in a late Cold War mentality that demanded American action beyond its borders to fulfill a superpower status against ideological threats like the Soviet Union and later radical Islam. Thus, this faction will likely pursue an agenda heavily focused on foreign policy, specifically putting pressure on Russia and making a villain of Putin, as well as promising a solution to the oil crisis, which will likely be pursued through an expansive global foreign policy. And whether or not this includes militarism, I don't know. But given the fact that this faction has much of the intelligence and security apparatus on its side, don't see it impossible that they manufacture a new crisis that only they can solve. The candidate that neoconservatives are upholding is Mike Pompeo. During his time as Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo largely appeased the Trump base of the MAGA movement and focused a lot of his nationalistic energy brought by Trump's movement to grow anti-China sentiments. But lately, Pompeo's been taking a lot of veiled jabs at Trump's 2020 obsession with the election and flat out called Trump deranged in a speech speech at the Republican Jewish Coalition Conference a couple of weeks ago. Pompeo and Haley would likely have a nearly identical agenda. However, Pompeo would at least push through some of the token tough-on-China policies to appease the anti-China crowd. Also expect some empty language on the conservative buzzwords of critical race theory and wokeness from the neoconservative faction, which they'll probably never follow through on. The neoconservatives' chances of victory are pretty far out. This is due to the fact that neoconservatives are the other side of a pact between them and Main Street Republicans. Their already small support base would be split in the primary between Pompeo and Haley. The Israel lobby and the foreign interest will split their financial support between Haley and Pompeo. Nonetheless, Mike Pompeo's support has really been dwindling as of recently, given the fact that he was a figure in the Trump administration who sabotaged a lot of the America First foreign policies. Additionally, much of the conservative base, including many of the key funders, have moved away from this neoconservative foreign policy focus. At the Western Conservative Summit in Denver, Pompeo polled at only about 39.3% when asked if voters would approve if he were named the nominee come 2024. At CPAC, Pompeo placed similarly in a straw poll for the conservative nominee, polling at around 2% of attendees choosing him as their top pick for 2024. The neoconservatives' main support base is among fiscal conservatives, market advocates, transnational corporations, suburban female Republicans ages 40 to 65, disaffected non-religious Trump supporters, and so on. And much of his support base has really splintered since to another faction that we're going to be talking about later. But I expect that the neoconservatives will likely focus on strengthening their influence in battleground states for the Republican Party. I expect them to focus less on the presidential primaries, and I expect them to put more of their efforts into Senate races, like aiding Dan Crenshaw in a Senate race in Texas, which he will run for. Bet on it, I promise you. And Alex Mooney, who will probably run for Senate in West Virginia. All in all, a neoconservative dominance would similarly disenfranchise much of the Republican voter base, as many of these people who have devoted themselves to the conservative movement with the Trump revolution would feel left behind. Given Pompeo and the neoconservative faction's evident and previously disguised opposition to Trumpism, the Republican Party would further become fractured. Given the fact that foreign policy is not an issue that most of the people in the politically active Republicans care too much about, at CPAC this year, among many of the most politically active conservatives, foreign policy was one of the most important issues to only about 22% of respondents. And this is even after the Russia-Ukrainian war broke out. Meanwhile, during the midterms exit polls, it didn't even make the top 5, disenfranchising the base and largely limiting the party to a regional influence and further disunity. I could see this faction putting up an alternative candidate for the nomination and filling the role as an alternate. I could probably see Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker being upheld. Baker is sort of a moderate Republican who says all the right things and makes people feel safe while granting these token promises on issues like guns, critical race theory, and such. We're talking about a guy that gave a big speech on cracking down on extremist elements in the Republican Party. Baker also fills that war hawk foreign policy, and dominance under Baker would largely have a similar effect to Pompeo. But that does it for the neoconservative faction. The next faction that we're going to be talking about is what I call the old right. Okay, so the old right. We covered a version of them in our past series, and this faction can largely be associated with the old right in Mr. Z's video, but this faction makes up a broader coalition. The root mentality of this faction is ethical conservatism, based once again in old Southern American values, and these guys are the modern Jacksonians of the Republican Party. Ethics of this faction are often exploited in their unwillingness to break from the norms of politics, and continued alignment with Reagan demonstrates an antiquated nature to this faction that really makes them pretty impractical in modern politics. A hands-off approach makes this faction largely ineffective outside of the local politics, despite their prominence on the national scene. The focus of their exercising of political power is limited to the surrendering of power to the states, even at the loss of their own conservative vision for America. This faction is generally pretty based when it comes to policies, but really only allowed them to pursue them on a state level, not on a federal one. But the old right, however, disenfranchises the growing right-wing elements of the Republican Party, as they will often position themselves as opponents of the MAGA movement in order to save face and continue to engage in respectable politics. This is a very limiting attribute for their faction, as it often leads them to adopt liberal structure of morality by so actively rejecting any one put forth by the more right-wing elements in the youth. Currently, the old right is divided between two sub-factions divided by the candidate that they support. And the first sub-faction of the old right is what I call the moderate faction. This sub-faction is in support of Tim Scott, a senator from South Carolina. And Scott has been a pretty average senator for the Republicans, but has often supported liberal causes. The reason that he's not in the neoconservative faction is because he's not a staunch foreign policy advocate. To quote my friend Red Eagle Politics, he's an awful senator. He's basically John Boozman from South Carolina. And the main reason that the old right is holding him up as a potential nominee for 2024 is for one reason, and I think you guys can guess what that reason is. The main reason that this faction holds him up is because they want to see a black man on the ticket. But the black vote doesn't work like that. Scott fails to mobilize black voters in any real or tangible way. His support base is limited to fiscal conservatives, pro-life voters, Christians, evangelical Southerners, upper middle class white women, and Fox News viewers. And dominance of Scott's sub-faction would likely disenfranchise much of the Republican base, given Scott's support of progressive causes like BLM. Scott polls behind Pompeo, getting at around 1% of the Republicans at CPAC, favoring Scott as their first choice. However, if Tim Scott fails to generate the momentum that they're looking for, I could see them exchanging this support base with that of Rick Scott from Florida, especially if they're trying to appease the more MAGA elements of their party. But I ultimately see the moderate wing of this faction being outshined by the contenders in the opposition wing. And the oppositional wing of this faction is the traditional wing. And this sub-faction is united in its support of Mike Pence. Pence largely represents the same base as Scott, but he pursues a more openly traditional view of cultural issues. You know, Pence pursues traditional right-wing policies like opposition to gay marriage and strong immigration policies. However, a lot of his political agenda is relegated to empowering states to pursue these policies on their own. I can see Pence getting support of certain elements of the Republican Party, and his dominance would not disenfranchise the more right-wing elements of the Republican Party as much as the previous factions would, given the fact that Pence would grant token policies of opposition to the Respect for Marriage Act, strengthening the border, and such. I think that Pence is a very skilled politician for the conservatives, and he has a lot of policy appeals for even the more right-wing elements of the Republican Party. I think Pence will come out and highlight his populist record on an array of issues, including trade, immigration, and even gay marriage, to appeal to the more right-wing elements. But I also think him positioning himself as an opponent of President Trump could limit his appeals, as it would polarize the base and really sow more division. His chances are not bad at making it through the primaries, and I think that a lot of the PAC money that's backing him will get him out in front of the faces of the primary voters. And I've heard from people behind the scenes of this stuff, and let me tell you that Pence has a lot of influence over many of the key name donors for the conservative movement. This could really help him get his name and face in front of the cameras. And you know, Pence has also the full support of the Young America's Foundation as well as the Young Americans for Freedom. This would essentially be mobilized as his youth wing in no time. It's also very likely that the political machine will have total mobilization in support of Pence's campaign. I expect to see figures like Newt Gingrich and Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, as well as people like Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, to be mobilizing the political machine in Washington to support Pence. I also think that the RGA's support base will likely be divided between Pence and another governor that we're going to be talking about later. But at the Western Conservative Summit in Denver, Pence polled at about only 21.5% supporting potential presidential run by him in 2024. And if Pence fails to capture the MAGA base, I could see them exchanging him for a figure like Marco Rubio. Rubio has similar appeals in the same way that Pence does, but I see it more likely that Rubio joins the next faction that we're going to be talking about, because last election cycle he campaigned as such. The old right faction saw wins in the midterms, re-electing John Hoeven in North Dakota, Mike Crapo in Idaho, Mike Lee in Utah, re-electing Tim Scott in South Carolina, John Boozman in Arkansas, and so on. Thus, the old right faction is quite effective at empowering already strengthened Republican strongholds, but it's not really that effective when it comes to mobilizing would-be Republicans in competitive areas. I think that the old right has the potential to unify the party under a conservative vision for America. Nonetheless, I do think that they're going to lean into their politician tendencies as they fail to captivate some of the more crucial bases necessary to elevate the Republican Party to a national stage. And I think that this kind of frustration would further fracture the Republican Party and relegate it to state and regional politics. And while the party might side with this faction in order to supposedly reach independence or have a more positive influence in swing states, their efforts would probably be dumbfounded. They would likely fail to gain any meaningful support in states that President Trump won, like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and so on. But that does it for the old right. the next faction that we're going to be talking about is what I call the Americanist faction. Okay, so the Americanists are a new faction of the right that has previously existed within a coalition and a pact between them and the MAGA faction, which we'll be talking about later. However, this faction dissolved its coalition with the MAGA faction following the midterms. And the root mentality of this faction is MAGA conservatism, but toned down in order to maintain an appearance of respectful politics. And this is based, again, in old Southern American values. Their political prominence is as a result of the influence of Trump. The root mentality of this faction is rooted in inherent and natural conservatism associated with old Southern America, which stresses personal responsibility and federal opposition to liberal dominance. This faction is an outgrowth of the Tea Party, so it invigorates its base of members of the Tea Party, fiscal conservatives, supporters of small government, hardline Republicans, military veterans, senior citizens, gun owners, Christian evangelicals, suburban areas, and makes good gains amongst the conservative media audience. Now, I think we all know who the frontrunner for this faction is. This is the current golden child of the conservative movement, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. On a federal level, we could probably expect DeSantis to pursue an agenda opposing LGBT influence, strengthening the border, opposing critical race theory, and other key cultural issues I could see. I could see DeSantis abandoning his localist positions of politics for whatever the base supports. I also think that his Americanist faction could pursue a pretty standard Republican agenda, probably pretty similar to that of Trump's first term. Restrictions on immigration, focus on the economy, and such. I wish they would pursue some more policies that take down some of the codification of LGBT enforced diversity, but I see this as pretty unlikely. I would also love to see him overturn the Respect for Marriage Act, but I just don't see them doing anything out of the ordinary for a Republican president. Honestly, he would probably just be like Trump in his first term, because he'll likely hire the same circles of people who occupied Trump's government. Some are confident in DeSantis' ability to restructure key government staffers because he has fired a few liberal prosecutors from the Florida government, but I don't know if DeSantis is the kind of Republican president who will go after the intelligence apparatus or some of the foreign offices of the executive. I think that his agenda would probably be pretty standard for the modern Republicans, with even some more liberal elements probably infiltrating like they do all Republican presidents. They have a strong network of pundits on their side, which improves their standing with suburban women and men. Also, this faction has since attracted a lot of former donors of the MAGA faction in their split following the midterms. In his 4 most recent campaign committees, DeSantis raised about $10 million. DeSantis has a very broad coalition of donors now, ranging from statewide committees like Florida Congressional Committee, national funds like the House Freedom Fund, John Bolton PAC, Koch Industries, U.S. Israel PAC, and so on. And this faction saw big wins in the midterms alongside a coalition with the MAGA faction, picking up new seats with Ted Budd in North Carolina, J.D. Vance in Ohio, as well as re-electing John Thune in South Carolina, in Oklahoma with Mark Wayne Mullen, and so on, being one of 2 factions to elect new candidates to the Senate. I think that this faction has a good chance of becoming the coalition leader, if they're able to achieve party unity, of course. Given the fact that they're an offshoot of the MAGA movement, they are able to attract a lot of the conservative support base. Ron DeSantis is able to maintain a super high popularity in the state of Florida. He is largely responsible for a lot of the push for right-wing positions on the issues of education, LGBT, critical race theory, immigration, big tech, and such. Well, yeah, I know a lot of his bills on these issues are kind of toothless, but nonetheless, he's gained a lot of awareness on the issues. And also, DeSantis has a lot of key donors and could be really a leader for this faction. But nonetheless, DeSantis is really the first candidate since Donald Trump to bring together such a broad coalition and a broad base under his leadership. DeSantis has a huge rise following the midterms. Before the midterms, Trump was leading pretty much every single Republican poll for the primaries. At CPAC earlier this year, only about 28% of respondents identified DeSantis as their top choice for the nominee come 2024, and Real Clear Politics had DeSantis similarly back in October, then nearly breaking 40% in October. And I've seen several polls that show DeSantis breaking 74%. Given the fact that this faction has funded some of the most influential conservative pundit networks like the Daily Wire and Turning Point USA, it will likely play very well with suburban women and men picking up some of the youth and so on. Additionally, nearly 49% of Republicans hold election integrity as their top issue. And I've been hearing in the grapevine that DeSantis is trying to find a way to classify election fraud as a Class 3 felony in Florida. Meanwhile, 48% of people care about immigration and border security as their top issues. These are issues that DeSantis and the Americanist faction play to very, very well. This faction could unify the Republican base and pretty much all of the support groups of the party, as they largely put forth a cohesive conservative vision for America, although I think that their agenda is too reliant relying on legislation. Nonetheless, if Americanists throw their hat in the ring and run an offensive campaign against the MAGA faction, I think this could have really detrimental effects for party unity. If this were to happen, it is entirely possible that such a campaign could open the floodgates. It could also fracture his own faction and inspire other Americanist candidates to put their hats in the ring. As many as 3 candidates could do this, creating splinter factions with Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and potentially Glenn Youngkin. Even if this faction is able to dominate the party in the primaries, I still think that this faction would have trouble propelling the movement to the national stage. And this is especially true in the dire times that are approaching us in 2024. This is due to the fact that none of the possible representatives have quite the national appeal that the MAGA faction does. Even if they have a slightly less muddied reputation, it could be to their detriment. The Americanist faction has great appeals in the Deep South. DeSantis could pick up North Carolina, potentially Georgia, if the Democrats stop democratizing the elections. He'll pick up Texas, but people forget that a figure like DeSantis, like Josh Hawley, like Glenn Youngkin, they have a very low name recognition. Most people outside of Florida or the online political realm don't really know DeSantis that well, nor do they really give a crap about his accomplishments. People have to remember that after 2008, the default voting pattern for the average American is Democrat. That is, unless Republicans are able to mobilize would-be conservatives because of the name recognition. Many of the polls are pointing to the fact that Republicans just don't have the ability to mobilize these would-be voters with traditional politicians. I don't know if the Americanist faction has the ability to reach would-be Republicans in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and so on. If this faction is to win, like 2016 had for Trump, there has to be a need for this faction. The issues that matter to voters need to be unique to this faction. They need to offer something different. However, if DeSantis and this faction are going to unify the party, they're going to have to go about this in a very, very specific way. DeSantis right now is running as an anti-Trump candidate, an oppositional wing to the MAGA faction. If the Americanists and DeSantis want to win, they're going to have to play a great game of balance, okay? They're going to have to run a campaign that says, we're more conservative than the MAGA faction, we're to the right of them on issues XYZ, but also we're more approachable and there's less baggage with us. That'll be a tough balance, and if they can do it, they'll be the most agile faction in American history for that matter. But they certainly won't be able to do it without Republican unity, and they're going to need to rekindle a coalition with the next faction that we are talking about. This is the MAGA faction. So the MAGA faction appeared in 2016 and has previously existed within a pact between them and the Americanist faction, which we just discussed. However, the Americanists and the MAGA faction dissolved their coalition following the midterms in 2022. And this faction is the King's Movement, the base of Donald Trump. The root mentality of this faction is a dissatisfaction with the establishment in government, in politics, in economics, all of it. Unlike libertarians, the MAGA faction had a strong anti-establishment conservative cling to Trump, and they offer an alternative to abolishing the government system altogether. This faction is driven by Trumpism, and the intention to make America a country which places an emphasis on its forgotten native people and culture above corrupt ideological interests. The leader of this faction is Donald Trump. And look, this is Trump's faction. He not only founded it, he leads it, he funds it, he runs it, all of it. It's his faction in every sense of the word. Given the fact that a lot of Trump's key donors left him following 1/6, it's fully funded by him. And a lot of the Trump loyalist support base comes out of this hope that President Trump's second term is going to be super base. And look, from what I hear from a lot of staffers that Trump had in the White House, they anticipated that a second term would be a lot more positive and have a lot more populist, a lot more America first influence than his initial term, because once he gets reelected, he could go scorched earth, which is true on big tech, on immigration, on whatever. And now he has a reason to do that because he's been wronged. And a lot of Trump loyalists are looking to him to go into the system and uproot a lot of the bureaucracy that is undermining the America First agenda and favoring the liberalization of the country. Donald Trump has said publicly that in a potential second term, he would use an executive order that would make it easier for him to fire federal employees, where his White House would proceed to remake the executive branch in his image, ultimately turning over, quote, thousands of mid-level staff jobs in the executive branch. So the hope is that Trump can enter the White House and drain the swamp and rip the liberal establishment to shreds. Is this possible? Yeah, I mean, I don't put anything behind a man who has been chewed up and spit out by the liberal establishment in this country. You know, this is a man who has been wronged by the system. He's just like us, you know. He's tired of watching the government betray its citizens and do things that hurt them. He wants to make America great again, so don't put anything behind him to do that. The MAGA faction's chances for victory are very likely, but I still think that they're less than the Americanist faction, or even their own faction was in 2020. Nearly 49% of Republicans hold election integrity as their top issue. Meanwhile, 48% of them care about immigration and border security as their top issues, followed by inflation, foreign policy, the Second Amendment, and energy security. It's important to note that the MAGA faction is largely responsible for defining this agenda. They brought these issues to the forefront of the conservative movement through the faction's dominance from 2016 on. The MAGA faction has probably the largest tent support base of any conservative faction that has been seen since Reagan. This is largely because of the MAGA faction's ability to unify voters from all other factions under a common vision for a conservative America. The support base is likely to be made up of every group from men and women conservatives, young conservatives, constitutionalists, capitalists, centrists, evangelicals, right-leaning minorities, Second Amendment advocates, pro-lifers, the broader Christian right, especially invigorating sit-out voters in key states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and so on. The MAGA faction has previously been a unifying faction for everyone from the neoconservative base to more right-wing elements in the Republican Party, but I don't know if they still possess this ability to unify in just the way that they did. This faction saw big wins in the midterms alongside a coalition with the Americanists, picking up new seats with Ted Budd in North Carolina, J.D. Vance in Ohio, as well as re-electing John Thune in South Dakota, in Oklahoma with Mark Wayne Mullen, and so on. The only obstacle for them will be the split of their coalition with the Americanist faction. Because Trump has not provided a sufficient vision for conservative America like he had in 2016, his coalition with the Americanist faction has split from their informal pact. This was further exacerbated by Trump's lackluster announcement speech at Mar-a-Lago following the midterms. However, the MAGA faction is going to need to rekindle their support base, which is splintered into the Americanist faction, if they are to have unity. And if they fail to do this, I think that the old right will likely capitalize upon the divided support base between the MAGA Americanist coalition. And as we've already discussed, I think that this scenario would further divide the Republican base beyond a healthy limit. I don't think we could rebound from this kind of division. The MAGA faction and the Americanist factions need each other's support for party unity. And I don't think that any of the other factions we talked about today, besides the MAGA and Americanist factions, can do this. The best case scenario we have is for a Trump-DeSantis or DeSantis-Trump ticket. Honestly, this would provide unity, vision, and action. This is what the Republican Party needs. And that does it for the MAGA faction. Now for the last faction that really exists in the Republican Party right now, as of December 2022. This last faction is what I call the Vanguard Faction. The dawning of the Vanguard Faction in the conservative movement has proved that we are living in the strangest timeline for conservative politics. But the dawning of the Vanguard Faction in the conservative movement as an actual option come the primaries makes this the strangest episode in conservative politics that we've seen in a long, long time. This faction is led by Ye West, Fuentes, and Milo Yiannopoulos. But given that this faction is super loony, I think it deserves its own video breaking down all the complexities of it, and I think that this video is already way long enough. All in all, the Republican Party is fractured to an unhealthy extent. Like, I enjoy making these videos on factions within the conservative movement, but my goodness, I wish I didn't have to. I wish I didn't have to. The Republican Party is potentially facing extinction in 2024 if it's not able to consolidate itself into a single united movement. And no, Ronald Reagan worship is not going to cut it. Tax cuts are not going to cut it. Monetary policy, social security reform, even issues like immigration and legislation are not going to solve it, okay? Conservatives need vision. The only thing that is going to unite this fragile movement is vision. A candidate who offers a vision of a conservative America is the one who's going to win. I promise you. This is what Trump offered in 2016. People want to say, oh, it's his charisma. Oh, it's his policies. Oh, it's his blue-collar language. Oh, it's his demeanor. It's none of that. The reason that Trump won and that he unified the party in such a revolutionary way back in 2016, in a way that the Republican Party has not done since Ronald Reagan, is because Trump offered vision for a conservative America. That's why he won. I promise you. While every single other candidate was up on the debate stage talking about, oh, I'm going to enact this policy. Oh, look at my stainless record. Look at my spotless record. Making people fall asleep. Donald Trump went up there and he talked about his vision. He talked about his vision of an America made great again. Everything he said and everything he talked about inspired a vision of what America could look like under conservative control. Whichever faction dominates this great game that we're playing right now, which is the primaries, they need to offer vision. And failure to do so will fracture this already divided movement beyond repair. I promise you, we will die out. if we don't fix this division that's going on right now. And this is the reason that every single Republican and their grandmas is hinting at a run for president. You know, the candidates so far have not provided a sufficient vision for the conservative America. They haven't provided one, and that's why everybody and their grandmas jumping into the game. We have to unify under a vision for a conservative America. We will lose if we fail to do this, okay? We will lose, I promise you. It doesn't take the masses to lead a revolution. It takes a small group of highly motivated and unified people. The Bolsheviks in Russia knew this, as they were united in their command and their vision for Russia, while the White Russians had no vision, had no unified figure. And the same is true with the Spanish Civil War. You know, the same is true in every single conflict ever. We find ourselves in the middle of a domestic political Cold War, and we're not unified right now, so we're not going to win. These proxy battles and skirmishes, like the midterms were, are contributing to a greater war that's happening here between conservative America and a leftist America. The leftists know that, okay? The leftists are completely aware of it. They're aware of the war that we're fighting, and they know that the way for them to win is for them to crack our empire from within. How can Republicans have any time to fight against the people trying to trans their kids and import criminals into their neighborhoods when they're too busy fighting, you know, slightly less based person who agrees with me on nearly everything but supports slightly less based candidate? Oh my goodness. You know, there are manufactured attempts right now by special interests to sensationalize Republican divisions. Republicans are divided right now, okay? The conservative movement is on track to be conquered right now. This factionalism is killing our movement slowly. Republicans have to unify under a vision of a conservative America if our movement is to survive. And I don't say all of this to freak you guys out. I'm not saying that at all. I say this because our movement has the potential to save this country. We have the potential to make things great in this nation. We have the strength to defeat the leftists. The left is run by very weak and stupid people, frankly. You know, lesser men than us have faced greater enemies than we're up against right now. And they've won. We are on the side of the objective morality. We are on the side of truth. We're on the side of an America made great. We are on the side of God and his eternal kingdom. What's stopping us, guys? What's stopping us? Our own egos. That's the only thing. The only thing stopping us is our own disunity. We can resolve this very, very easily. We will be unstoppable, I promise you. But I hope you enjoyed this episode, Wolfpack. I hope you're able to navigate the Republican factions that will be appearing in 2024. Be sure to like and comment. If you're new, join the Wolfpack by hitting subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see ya. Bye-bye.